Hello and good afternoon, everyone, and warmly welcome to our Planning in Transition lectures. Today we have the honor to have Professor Greg Marsden here with us. I'm very excited. From Institute for Transport Studies from the University of Leeds. And I will actually just hand over the word for you. We have until 3. I don't think you will talk until 3, but feel free to talk as long as you want to, and then we open the floor for questions from in here and also from the audience, which is online.
Great. Thanks, Edith. You'll be pleased to know if you are in the room that I'm not going to be talking till 3 o'clock. Online, obviously, you could just disappear and do whatever and I wouldn't know. But anyway, thanks for either coming here or joining online. Greg Marsden from the Institute for Transport Studies, although it looks like I can't spell, that's ominous on my first slide. I've misspelt studies, but yeah, it's really pleased to have the chance to come and talk to you about how does place matter to decarbonisation strategies. This work is part of a 5-year pan-UK energy demand research centre. So it's kind of the third of a set of research centres. So this kind of strand of thinking, I guess, has been growing over 15 years, and it's part of a counterbalance, but hopefully an integration between a very technology-dominant pathway and one which tries to think about the role of social futures and avoid the artificial separation of technology and behaviour to see what the potential is. I lead the place theme in the new centre. So we've gone from being research which is done in silos of buildings, industry, transport, to thinking about place and flexibility and governance and trying to think in a cross-sectoral manner. So I come from a transport background. I will use some examples from the emerging work with colleagues in other sectors, but I'm really interested in other people's insights because obviously I have a tradition that I see things through, and I'm wanting to be challenged on that. So the structure of what I'm going to talk about, first of all, why talk about place in the first instance. Then I'll move into some definitions and understanding of place, which I then use to kind of critically reflect on national strategies and place, local strategies and place, and that they're not, local and place is not the same thing. I'll briefly introduce socio-technical imaginaries and place, as it's a kind of research provocation angle that we're thinking of using as part of our work, and I have one example of how I think this is actually really quite important. But I want to talk about, as we get towards the end, about the potential of place. So I might critique how place has not really had much of a feature in the way we develop our policies, but what would it mean if we took it more seriously? And how would we reconcile place and policy? And I've got some more incremental and some perhaps more transformative or generative ideas of ways in which we might do things differently, recognizing that sometimes you can have these discussions, people find it interesting to think about the world in a different way, but then this is how we make policy, and this is how we've always made policy. So moving from where we are now to where we might be is difficult. Okay, so I promise Carolina was in the audience on Tuesday in Stockholm, where I gave a very depressing talk about the state of UK transport climate policy. But policy is failing. So in the UK, the number of heat pumps that we've installed in the last 4 years is half of that which has been expected. We would need an 11-fold increase in installations by 2028 to be back on track with where we said we would be in installations. We had a 10% demand out of that, which had been anticipated for our last insulation scheme in the UK. We're 20% behind where the Committee on Climate Change had anticipated we would be in terms of the percentage of miles that are driven in electric vehicles. Our Scottish Government has just abandoned its 2030 target and failed to meet its targets in 9 of the last 12 years. So I'm not being dramatic in saying that policy is failing. I'm just being realistic in terms of where we are. So the fact that we're failing is one reason to ask why are we failing and to think, well, maybe place could play a role in that. But I think another reason why place is really important is not just that we're not delivering, but it's how we're delivering. And I really like well, it's attributed to Einstein, but it's also on Google, attributed to lots of other people. But if you want different results, don't just do the same thing. I think it's really important that the policy mindset that delivered us the inequitable outcomes that you see in our cities and countries at the moment is the same policy mindset which is designing the transition for us. So why would we expect that transition to address some of the structural inequalities in the way that the system has developed to date? So a piece of work which one of my PhD students has recently published, A Just Transition or Just a Transition, we explored transport strategies from local and regional bodies in the UK. We looked at the content of them, and then she interviewed the people who've been partly responsible for their assembly. And it's not that the word just transition doesn't feature in these documents. It's just very difficult to see how they've influenced how those documents were put together and the content of them. And as that quote says, I don't think we've ever sat and thought about our definition of fairness, something we've never really considered. And I think the kinds of inequities that are recognised are things of spatial distribution of public transport, but nothing about, for example, where will electric vehicles be taken up? Who will be paying less per mile and who will still be on fossil fuel vehicles and will be paying more? How do we deal with that differential pricing? Who can install these charge points and who can't? That's nowhere in the plans. The plan is how quickly will we electrify? And so I think unless we take a different approach to thinking about the transition, we will miss opportunities or we'll exacerbate some and we'll open new sites of inequality and unfairness. So place to me, I think, offers an opportunity to think about how we challenge that mindset. So promised to briefly introduce what we mean by place, and I still am struggling with this as a concept. I think it is inevitably going to be open to interpretation, and that's perhaps a good thing. So Patrick Devine-Wright, I think, has done some interesting work on this. So he starts with, it refers to a particular location in the world that has meaning for individuals and communities. So there's a big tradition in the relatively small place literature there, but let's not see this as the map. There's a paper by Gavin Bridge that I use. The territory is not the map. So let's not just confuse it by the boundaries that exist and which define how all our statistics get collected. Place could be much smaller than that, can be much bigger than that. It can join across scales. But places have different physical and ecological characteristics, different infrastructures, different political settings, different social and economic attributes, and they have different resources and histories. We were talking a little bit earlier about hydrogen as a kind of part of the transition in the UK. A lot of that is built around areas which have histories of petrochemical industries, and this is actually about sustaining and transitioning the industry, and that's why hydrogen is part of the discussion there and not part of the discussion in other parts of the country. In our theme, we're trying to see places as active participants in the transition. So, they have an impact on the way the transition occurs, but they also influence the policy making process, and they They have demands and needs and wishes, and therefore we should see them as active participants. So Stefan Buzarowski from Manchester is part of our theme. He writes on the relationality as well. Don't just see place as very local, also see it as relational. So what goes on in York, where I live, is very much related to what goes on in the next big city that's nearby. We've got an intertwined economic market. We're also depends on the energy resources in the area, depends on the energy networks which cross boundaries. So we have to see places in relation to each other, as well as looking at the characteristics of that place. And Divine Right and Ryder add on to that, the importance of social relations, both within places but also across places. But I think the thing that I really like Gavin Bridges' article, where one is situated spatially makes a difference to the question one needs to ask. You're thinking about the world in a different way in your setting, and therefore you might ask some different questions about what you want for your areas and how you might go about developing that. So that is really at the heart of our understanding of place. But I still think there's lots of space and fuzziness in that set of kind of characteristics, I suppose. But anyway, just to be clear, what place isn't, place is not location. Tim Cresswell's writing is really good on that. And place isn't some blank slate on which new things get put. That's essentially what Bridges saying there. It's landing already in a messy environment. So let's not just see place as this kind of blank slate on which our new net zero transition actions are going to happen. So I'll come back to some of those in this critique of national and local policy making and how it treats place. So I would argue that place is almost nowhere in the way we think about our net zero transition in the UK. And why does that happen? Well, I think it starts from it. We have an international framework with the UNFCCC. We agree our national commitments to the Paris Agreement, and then we enact those in national law. So for us, the Climate Change Act of 2008, which we've updated. And from that, we end up then with a series of kind of national strategies. So advice to the government from our Climate Change Committee gets turned into a national strategy. Maybe we'll have some sectoral strategies. That's our decarbonising transport plan. But it's the national level which is responsible for the achievement or otherwise of our targets. So what do we then do when we have this national commitment? Well, we start to write about cross-sectoral pathways. So this is a chart from our, sorry, I've got some notes that I need to look at on here. These are charts from our net zero strategy. So national pathways, you've got to think about all of these different things together. So we've got domestic transport, international aviation, heat and buildings, industry, waste, agriculture, fuel supply, power. So it's very complex and it's multi-sector. And in order to think about alternatives, there are so many different variables that you could start to consider when you're looking across all these different sectors, that you inevitably work in an aggregate manner, because otherwise you couldn't think of a sensible modelling framework. You wouldn't really be able to understand all the different levers that you thought you were pulling. So we work at a fairly aggregate scale, and we look across the whole economy. So we might have regional models, but generally ours are working at a national scale. But this also aligns with thinking about how we regulate our national networks, what our big infrastructure programs would be, what are our trading arrangements? What are the flows of commodities in the economy? And so working at that scale, there is no room for place in this kind of modelling framework. So it's just to acknowledge that rather than saying, we shouldn't do cross-sectoral modelling. When we drill down a little bit further into our national strategies, then a lot of ours, certainly in the UK, the primary driver is technology-led. That's stated by the government. Also, our Committee on Climate Change has said that it will look for technology solutions first and only look for behavioural solutions where there isn't an affordable and meaningful technology to deliver the transition. So we're very much focused on the technology market. So the questions that you ask when you're looking at technology adoption is, how quickly will these technologies be adopted? So we look at cost functions. What's the cost of a heat pump now? What might that be in 5 years' time as we scale up production? What's the cost of electric vehicle batteries? How quickly will we get price parity in purchase and therefore start to see consumers making those choices without subsidies and so on? So we look at things like, how often do these things naturally get replaced? And then we start to think about the role of income, perhaps, as to who will adopt early and who won't adopt early. And again, I would argue in that thinking, there isn't really any exploration of the role of place. So this is still done at a relatively national and sometimes international level when we're thinking about prices and technology change and so on. So when we take that approach, what we end up with is place as a second order explanation. So let's take the example of electric vehicle uptake. So essentially what happens is we introduce a national policy and then we start to notice that there's variable adoption within the system. So it could be variable adoption of EVs, and we look at why is that the case? Well, actually, the charge infrastructure is not being distributed around the country in an even fashion. So we've asked the market to largely provide our public charge infrastructure, and therefore they concentrate in the places where there's highest demand, which doesn't provide you with a national network. It provides you with concentration in particular pockets. So the government commissioned a study of how many local electric vehicle charge points we would need. So the problem is solved by adding on a solution, not thinking about whether we've thought about the whole adoption process in the right way from the first place. The answer from their assessment model was somewhere between 280,000 and 720,000 by 2030. And if anyone does modelling, that's a wonderful range to allow yourself to have in 7 years, isn't it? But what was interesting from reading that document is they acknowledged there's no spatial component to the model and that we'd need further analysis using area-specific inputs if we wanted that to be more granular at a local level. And they averaged it across all days of the year. So place, again, is nowhere. There's no thinking about, well, what about the massive tourist flows that happen in the UK and the imbalance between what you'd provide for the resident population and what you provide for the population in the peak months. It was just one example. So if this is how you see the landscape, what are the policy responses? They tend to be add-on fixes. Places are variable to be thought about in the adoption process. It's not a source of thinking about how the policy should be designed in the first place. And in the centre that we're working on, we've decided to try and test ourselves in a sense as to how you can translate national thinking through to a local level. So we have in the predecessor centre built a a set of more sustainable scenarios for the future called positive low energy demand futures, and the website's there for anyone who wants to explore them. So 4 scenarios: ignore, steer, shift, and transform, where we imagine different social futures which would enable us to carry on living happy, positive lives, but just with very different energy demands and therefore carbon emissions. And we converted those scenarios through what's a pretty typical kind of national approach, although perhaps a little bit more integrated than some of our national models. So we had 5 sector level models where we had to translate the scenarios into what would be happening in that sector. And I'll give you a mobility example shortly. And then we looked at the interlinkages. So we looked at, well, okay, if this future has lower car ownership, then it also has lower materials and products, and therefore we need to make sure that feedback is captured in the system. If we have more veganism, then we'll have less intensive meat farming, and therefore we can have more nature net gain, those kinds of trade-offs. And then we integrated them into one national model. So I'm not going to focus on like the national model results, but it's just to say we've built a national model and had to make many of the kinds of assumptions that I was critiquing earlier. So we ended up with, for mobility, not a significant change particularly, not an increase, but not a significant change in the kilometres travelled, but a very different mix of how those kilometres were serviced across the whole of the UK. So we did look at what would happen to short trips, what would happen to longer trips, what would happen to business trips, what would happen to leisure trips. So probably getting a little bit more into the social part of a national modelling framework than we typically would with the kind of Department for Transport approach, but still operating at an aggregate national scale. So again, that's just to give you a feeling for the sorts of things that we're working with. But the question then is, how does that relate when you break it down below a national level? How do you break that down below a national level? So the outcome has to be the sum of the parts for it to be a coherent scenario. If we're achieving an 80% reduction, that 80% has to be added up across all of the actions in the country. So how do we imagine those improvements will be distributed across the UK? And for some topics like veganism, well, there's limited evidence, for example, that changes in diet are particularly place-specific. They are culturally specific, and those may be distributed in slightly different ways across the country, but that's not a kind of big concern for us in terms of how that might be distributed. But reductions in car use, that's got very well established variability about the pre-existing networks and services and the location of activities in different places. So how do we go about distributing that? So what are the principles of allocating national to local? So I'll take a bit of time to explain this chart. So we've got an activity, so let's say it's miles commuting or something like that on the left hand, on the y-axis. And then we've got 10 different areas that have got different levels of commuting. So the green line is our current baseline. If we allocate a uniform reduction and assume that everywhere in the country is contributing the same amount, then we end up with the blue line. So that kind of doesn't put any greater emphasis on the high consumers or the high consuming areas. It just assumes that everywhere will be able to achieve commuting reductions. Or we could go for the convergence or equality, which is the kind of purple flat line, which is by the end of the transition, everywhere will have the same. Probably not realistic, but worth thinking through. Some places then would be allowed more, whereas others would make much bigger reductions. And then the equity-based is a kind of hybrid of those. So we won't expect as big a reduction in areas that already commute less. We'll expect more action from those that commute more. And then we thought about capability-based, because those are all kind of ways of allocating, but in what ways do they map the potential realism of delivering those changes? So we thought, well, should we have a capability-based allocation? So those places that have better public transport networks, for example, might be able to deliver more, or have already shown perhaps that they can deliver more. But doesn't this just write in all of the structural inequities that we had previously? If we decide that those places that are already good at doing things can do more, then we'll end up potentially exacerbating this. Now, I think at the start of the project, we kind of had a feeling that we'd be able to create some scenarios that really would potentially be meaningful translations of the national picture to the local level. I think what we've settled on now is actually we might generate some methodologies, but actually the critical thing that we've come to realize through just thinking about how we do it is this downscaling is deeply political. The imagination of what that national strategy looks like at lower tiers has got real consequences, which could be one reason why that's never made visible. But whether you make it visible and say how you imagine that downscaling to be occurring or not, there is still implicitly some notion of how that will be downscaled. So again, places kind of absent from that kind of discussion. Maybe it could be brought in through thinking in a more capability-based way. But our thinking is we need to use this as provocation for discussion about, well, really, are these areas going to achieve this? And what would that area look like if it had to do more? Is that really what you're saying here? I think people can be very comfortable with a 30% reduction across an area like the north of England, because they don't have to think about whether that 30% is their area, or that subset of that area is actually 50, 60% more. Now, obviously one response to that is to say, well, that's not the role of national. We have local strategies, right? So bottom-up thinking, and we've had a long tradition in this from local Agenda 21, cities as agents of change and networks of cities, early in the climate movement, working beyond state actors and so on. And that's where the vast majority of climate emergency declarations are, more than 2,000 around the world, covering like nearly 1 billion people. So but there is a bottom-up movement to be thought about here. And local is a place where some of the national silo thinking actually gets brought together, because all implementation happens locally. And so this is where those knotty issues of how different sectors work together really actually matter. And then there's a direct and very legitimate claim, like 1/3 of emissions are either directly under the responsibility of local authorities to do things like social housing and transport provision and so on, or indirectly through the way they manage procurement and so on. So there's a lot that local authorities can do. They have a lot of agency in this, even if they feel underpowered and would like more. But local, so I talk about place rather than local, because local is also artificially territorial. The electoral boundaries that we have for our local authorities were established 100, often sometimes more years ago than that, and not because they were designed in a way that were optimal for thinking about the climate crisis. It was, refuse collection or whatever it was at the time that those boundaries became what they were. So local can also be an artificial kind of scalar boundary. And I think we also have to see that as part of a political relation between state and local as well. it's not necessarily thinking about place from the perspective of the definitions I gave earlier. It's about arguments about what local should do in order to access resources and powers from national government and that political struggle. So again, maybe just walk through a couple of examples. I think the same critique that I made of national strategy can also be levelled at a local scale. So this is the draft Leeds transport strategy to be carbon neutral by 2030. It doesn't have a plan to be carbon neutral by 2030. It's got a kind of 63% gap, that big orange line. But it has ambitious plans to massively increase bus, rail, cycle, walking, and to reduce car trips. But in its strategy, it doesn't explain where that's happening in the city and how that's distributed between different parts of the city. So, let's just have a look at a bit of northeast Leeds, part of the more deprived neighbourhoods towards the northeast of the city. Around 35% of households don't have a car in this area. Just next door in Ladywood and Oakwood that you can see there, it's about 15%. You don't have to go too much further out and you're on the edges of Leeds City and you're down to like 5% of households. And we've got a huge commuting area around the edge of the city. So where's the 30% of car trip reduction really coming from? And are we going to talk about what that will actually mean for those communities, all the policies that would need to exist? We don't have those discussions, so we kind of replicate the same invisibility of place in the actual detail of the strategy, even at a local scale. Now, there are some local strategies which I think begin to approach that problem more, and I think you see that more when you look across transport and the economy, for example, where they really start to look at those places that have got greatest economic disadvantage. But in general, in our transport strategies, we don't deal with the detail of place. We talk about strategies in a fairly aggregate way. And I think part of the reason for doing that is that local authorities are completely under-resourced in the UK. We've had very significant austerity since 2008, and that's continued kind of post-COVID, a second acceleration in that. And in some work that Acilia Verlingerian colleagues did in the previous Energy Research Centre, we looked at 3 kind of leading local authorities, and we tried to work out what their transport strategies were trying to do for decarbonisation. And essentially, what the work found is that the local authorities were concentrating their efforts on where funding competitions were happening, because that's where they could get some additional resources. They were cash starved, so they needed to go and find the money. And so they would concentrate their interventions in small areas where they could demonstrate success and therefore look better than their neighbouring authorities. So when the next funding competition came out, they would be in a good place to also capture resources for that. So Acilia refers to it as a kind of elite spaces of experimentation and kind of competition. They're not being mainstreamed across the whole of the city. They're part of a kind of funding strategy. So that she calls it financialization, essentially, of local authority. So local authorities are not asking, how do we fund our strategy, but what can we fund? And this is our strategy. So again, place kind of disappears from thinking when you're resource dependent. So again, it's another reason why I'm not totally comfortable with local being the right descriptor and the right approach. Okay, I think finally on problematizing, or maybe there's one more. We also need to think about transport as a kind of multi-scalar challenge anyway. So one of the things that cities do in setting carbon targets is to draw a boundary about what they will and won't include. So in Leeds, it's commuting trips within the city, which is only a small part of the carbon which they're responsible for. It's referred to as methodological cityism, and that certainly is even more important for things like freight, where we talk about first and last mile, but we don't address consumption and we don't address the large-scale movement of freight across the economy. In the UK, 65% of our trips are less than 5 miles in length, but that's only 18% of miles that are driven. The vast majority of miles driven are in the 5 to 35 mile bucket, which really is about movements between adjacent local authority areas. But there's still a third, and this is just car mileage, not freight, there's still a third which are longer than 35 miles. So when we talk about relationality, we have to think about the interactions between what's going on in one place and what's going on in adjacent places. So I think this notion of places being relational is incredibly important from a transport perspective in a way that doesn't necessarily apply across all parts of the economy. Okay, so 2 slides then on the final reason why I think place needs to play a more important role is how technologies are being imagined and brought into the system. So the electric vehicle is being seen as a substitute for the fossil fuel car. And the early imaginations of what an electric vehicle would be were around the ability to be able to plug in your vehicle at home and charge that vehicle, and therefore for it to essentially be as identical a replacement for the fossil fuel vehicle that you have now as possible, so that charging wasn't kind of a problem for your user. Now we see the continuation of that with the connection of it to the smart grid, not just for kind of time of day, but also as a potential to feed back into the grid in order to reduce the costs of grid upgrade. But again, that presupposes the ability to connect at home, and it makes some places part of this mainstream transition, and then it makes some other places essentially other. They're not the mainstream socio-technical imaginary. And this really matters. If you started from place, and this is a street, not untypical street you'll find in every town in the UK. If you thought, let's electrify transport, you wouldn't think what we all need is a plug at home, right? So we haven't even sorted out how much parking we should have in our local areas. Parking on pavement is endemic. There's 1 or 2 councils that have banned it, but in general, that's kind of a taboo because we haven't we're not willing to talk about what the alternative looks like. So then the socio-technical imaginary, well, we need a solution then to that, don't we? So perhaps what we need to do is a bit of this, a bit of on-street charge infrastructure, taking away some parking space, but maybe that can be negotiated, but not in the place that looks like the one up there, because we haven't even decided that we need parking places other than on the pavement. So this is not a solution for that. So the next stage of the imagination is this. So this is now being trialled in a couple of local authorities in the UK, where they cut a gully across the footpath, and you pay a small amount of money. It's partly subsidized. And then you can have a box on the wall of your house and then trail your cable through the gully without tripping anyone up and connect it to your car. This, to me, fundamentally rewrites the allocation of space in our cities. This is a public footpath which we have now made private because that's what the socio-technical imaginary is demanding. Okay, and so you're now responsible for maintaining that strip of public land, but it's now yours, so it's private. We haven't decided how we're going to deal with it. You can see a kind of not uncommon channel that's been dug through the middle of the pavement by the services where they've been putting in broadband, but it could be, gas replacement or whatever that's done that. Who's responsible for that when that goes wrong? But even more than that, I would say, although when you sign up to dig one of these gullies, you don't get permission to park car outside your house because you've signed a piece of paper saying that. When you've spent a few €100 on that gully, I think you probably think that is your car parking space. And therefore, we've now rewritten the allocation of road space. So what if we wanted to green that? What if we wanted a cycle lane there? I'm sorry, we're allocating this somewhere else. Because we're not starting with place, we're starting with technology. And therefore, the question is, what needs to happen in order to allow that to unfold in this location? Okay, so how are we going to think about how place matters? So I think essentially it's starting with Bridges' point, which is different types of places will lead you to ask different sorts of questions. So we're going to identify a set of significantly different but interesting and not unique, as in there'll be other places with similar characteristics around the UK, and explore actually what kind of transition they would like to see, what's happening at the moment, and how difficult will the mainstream imagination be for that kind of place, to see whether we can think about alternative approaches, and if so, what would those look like? So this is Whitstable. It's a town of 32,000. It's located where the red dot is up there. That's a bit of the southeast coast of England. So London would just be away to the west of that particular map. So it's commuter belt-ish for London. It's got significant deprivation in particular parts and in the surrounding area in particular. It's got a lot of holiday homes and holiday lets. So the homes are not in use all year, but it also has a number of buildings, such as bed and breakfasts, which are used in ways which are completely overutilized compared to what they were constructed for and what most people would be thinking the energy demands for a typical terraced house, for example, would look like. So we have a PhD student who's beginning shortly to explore this, but some of the issues that we're thinking, apart from the kind of very different utilization patterns, is how does this work for landlords? How do landlords engage with the transition? They have a very different set of financial incentives, perhaps. What about second homeowners, who are somewhat different from landlords in certain cases? What about how these places are used when they're very intensively used in the summer? How different is the seasonal profile? How different are the behaviors of people when they're away from their own environments? What's the relation between the holiday economy and the commuting economy? And it's, the people who are traveling to and from London. What about the very rich versus the very poor division that we see in this kind of area? What about migrant labour? What questions does that begin to pose? So, electric vehicle charging in touristic areas is another example of the market's not going to provide in the way that might be necessary for certain periods of the year. How would that work? So this is one interestingly different place, and I'm not sure we know quite what we mean by Whitstable. Is it all of Whitstable, Whitstable and the surrounding areas? That kind of has to emerge, I think, from the research. The second one is York and its surrounding areas. So this is my hometown at the moment. It has a historic core with a walled city, Roman and Viking remains. You were there before before I was. 30,000 students in a town of 250,000. So it's got a big student population, which does interesting things again to the housing market and the distribution of housing. Relatively affluent, high for the UK levels of cycling, but it's got a really wealthy rural hinterland that you can see on the top picture there. Very high emissions, very car dependent, very right wing in terms of its historical voting tendencies. It's a rail hub. It's got good connections north-south on the London-Edinburgh line, as well as east-west. That brings certain industries to the city. It's traditionally been a chocolate town, still has a Nestle factory. 9 million tourists a year. So again, the kind of heterogeneity of use of York and what it is as a place varies quite considerably over the year. I'll flag just one example of interesting differences that come from somewhere like this. The place that you can see in the middle of the pictures there is just inside the city walls. It's a conservation area. No solar panels, no heat pump boxes, no electric vehicle charge points. So what's the transition and massive amounts of social capital around conservation. So a very different kind of culture about what the middle of the city is. But it's also an ancient middle of the city. It's got all sorts of different buildings of very different characteristics that don't conform to the kinds of imagination of what the housing stock mix really would look like. And it's a city that floods as well, which I think poses a lot of challenges for the types of electrification solution. There's no room for new substations in the middle of the city because it's very condensed. So what do we do about electricity demand? So again, I think if we start here and we think about the place, not just locally, but then what does that mean then? If we don't have this, how do we connect to that? What's the different ways in which we can access some of the things which are going on in the region around us if it's difficult here? So what are the compensations that might be made if we can't do this here and we've got to do that somewhere else? I think it begins to have that feeling of generating ideas, but also thinking, puzzling through whether what's being provided is actually sufficient. So yeah, so I think place provides us with some interesting nexus questions, looking within diversity of issues and practices within particular locations. But I think it provides us opportunities to look across. So Whitstable is not the only coastal town. What are the similar issues that you find in places like that, and what's distinctive? But I think we're also, it's a kind of demand that we have to look across the sectoral silos, and I think local does that anyway to some degree, but I think it allows us to look across sectors as well for multiple exclusions or opportunities. But I think it also demands that we look beyond. So we can't afford for place just to become about the interests of the locality without its relationality to other places, to national standards, to pricing and infrastructures that exist beyond that location. So we have to make that connection out, as well as understanding much better the diversity of within. So I promised a couple of reflections on how we might use these insights, and I've kind of put them, first one, within paradigm. So if I was going to go to our department for net zero, what would I say to them? Well, I think I would say that you could use place to much better understand the combination of the different programs that you have going on at the moment, and you could understand where is at risk of multiple exclusions, or simply where is not a fit to the programs that you have in place. And you could use that to design alternative new policies. That's a kind of response to what's already there. I think we could also think about what I've called here as locale archetypes. So we're beset with behavioral science in understanding our transition. So we're very much on the individual behavior change route in the UK when behavior does have to change. But what they've done recently in the transport sector is to say, well, let's at least establish a set of characters against which we can test the ideas for the policies that we're bringing forward. It's not perfect, but at least it provides you with a kind of how will Brian, who's the wheelchair user and a door-to-door experience is important, how will it affect Brian rather than Gina, who works in social care and uses her car for work? I've got 2 slides left, and now if you're online, you've got a better experience, because I think you can probably see my slides on. So the alternative was to kind of flip the paradigm and actually see place as generative of strategy rather than as receptive and you know, a source of variation. So if we put place at the center of policy design rather than the technologies or the behaviors, we'll ask questions like, what do places need? Who are the stakeholders there, and what are they trying to achieve? Not just within the net zero mission, but how does this connect to the wider kind of changes going on in that particular area? What do we understand about how knowledge passes through communities in these different kinds of places? So to what extent are we reliant on state intervention? To what extent have we got more community-based diffusion pathways, for example, that might be helpful? We would address things like class inequalities, infrastructure and service deficits. We'd start to ask questions about how those things will get paid for, rather than talking in very general terms about socializing the cost of the transition. What does that mean? It means everyone pays, but only certain areas get a say in how they benefit. Again, not a purely local place matter, but a way in which place has to or could interact with national level discussions. We'd understand much more about where the co-benefits are quite distinct in different areas. So I think we would be asking different questions back up to local and national policymakers about what policy should be and how diverse policy might need to be in order to achieve the kinds of goals that are being imagined, or indeed some new or additional aims. I thought that was amazing as well. At least I can see what's on my screen. So yeah, I guess to conclude then, for me, place matters, and it matters a lot, whether it's recognised or not. And I think that's the thing that we, in our centre, really need to engage with national and local policymakers over, that they're making assumptions and they're not delivering because they're not considering the environment onto which they're dropping their solutions adequately. So it will inscribe or widen inequalities, and it certainly won't deliver the kinds of adoption pathways that they imagine. We will continue to make slow progress against what's believed to be necessary. And that then creates further pressures for wider, more radical action, which it gets more and more difficult to achieve. And I think at a local level, we replicate some of this, but it's, you know, we are closer to maybe place-based thinking, but local really also lacks, I think, systemic coherence at the moment. And I would like to see more of a recursive relationship between how we think about what goes on, whether it's place or even local authority level and national level. We have to understand these interconnections between the more local and the more national, and put them in dialogue and intention with each other, because otherwise, you know, if we're only interested in the local walking and cycling trips, then that does nothing really for the big scale of the transition. We can't get captured by place being just about what goes on within those particular spaces. So I think seeing place as a lens to explore the transition in context is really important. I think relationality is also really important. One thing I worry about is exceptionalism. Oh, you pick that particular place, or that place is different. The question is, what are the common threads that come out of looking at those places? We can't design a billion policies, but we can certainly be more pluralistic than we currently are. Anyway, we're still developing this. It's not straightforward at all for us. So we'd welcome your thoughts, ideas, and experiences. So, thank you. Will that work?
That's a good question. However, I actually think that one is dropped out of Zoom, so I think that's. Can you hear me now online? No, can we? Should I see that? We'll make the test again. Gavin, can you hear us? So maybe it's only in Greg's computer somewhere working. Yeah, it seems like that.
So you can only hear when I talk. Is that right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then we
hello.
can still maybe ask
Yeah,
questions in
I
here, and
hear
then
you,
we
yeah.
might repeat the question.
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
can also read the questions if there are some
Yeah.
questions online.
Okay, I hear
You
you.
just have to.
Yeah. Fine. Okay. So I'll repeat any questions from in the room.
Yeah, hello, hi.
Yes, please. Thank you so much, Greg. Really interesting and thought-provoking. And I was wondering, in the UK system, are there any specific policies that have the ambition to create this type of dialogue between national and local levels? Like, specific incentives for local places or specific, anything that's the kind of idea in it, or that could be,
We've had quite a tradition of local citizens assemblies, but I would say they're probably, by the nature of them, they're not particularly place-oriented and context-oriented. It's bringing people together to talk about a set of issues. They're all from roughly one area, but that's not so much focused on that. I mean, there is local agency over things like the local vehicle charge point funding. So the local authorities get to decide where to put them. The answer being, where have we got public space that we have the right to locate them on? So leisure centre car parks or certain bits of the public highway where they think they've got room to accommodate these things. So again, it doesn't start with what does that community need. I've had a very interesting discussion with Leeds, which may be one of the case study areas. They have a relatively affluent neighbourhood, maybe 2 kilometres out of the city centre, old terraced houses, overparked, probably in the national imagination, an early adopter community for electrification, but they're getting all sorts of pressure now from people who want to do this, but their place isn't enabling them to do it, and they don't really want. Some of them do, and some of them don't want to go down the cable gully route. So for me, it's exposing the fact that who's had a discussion with that area about what net zero means for them and what kind of community that would look like in 20 years, both with different types of options, but also not doing very much at all. What would it look like? So yeah, it kind of exposes to me that we don't really engage in that, and I think it's possibly a resource issue. We have neighbourhood planning, but it's not very well resourced, and there's no requirement for anyone to do anything, particularly as a result of the neighbourhood plan. But it's kind of a little disconnected from then the policy implementation. So I feel like we're a bit weak, and maybe other places do that better than us.
I might have to ask you for another favor. If there are any questions, I don't know if they can see that I wrote if they have any questions. So if you would just ask them, because I don't think they hear us very well because we don't stand there. If they have any questions, we can write them.
Okay, if you have any questions online, can you put them in the chat or the Q&A? Yeah, in the chat.
have a question.
Arian has.
Yeah, hello. Yeah. Hi, Greg. Do you hear me?
I think so.
Do you hear me?
I'm not sure.
Oh. Yeah, hello.
I think you've unmuted Arian, but
Yeah.
questions. Have I got any sound coming out of mine?
Yeah, I hear you. I do hear you,
Turn
but
my microphone off so we didn't get any feedback. So
okay.
people may have been talking. Can you
Yeah,
try
hello.
again, Marion?
Yeah, hello.
No, not hearing.
Oh, okay.
There'll have to be
But
text in the chat function or the Q&A.
Yeah, I think they should be able to write the things in the chat function. Yeah.
Okay, so use the chat if you have a question online rather than the Q&A, and then at least Ida will know where to look.
So it's right. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much for this interesting lecture. Bringing place into the entire discussion. I tend to think that what is driving transport is the old central place theory. That is how industrialization have modeled the urban areas. Less important schools, hospitals, schools, recreation areas, and all that. I just have somewhere where you have land use, but I'm not hearing you talking about land ownership transformation, because that will also give us an idea. Because there is a great case who is talking about this infrastructure scattering. I really don't know whether, because I don't really understand how this transport transition will come alive when we are just building all urban folks. I don't see that kind of solution. I mean, you have mentioned us a picture of people parking on the pavement. I mean, cars are becoming cheaper. It will become cheaper. I think this will just only create more and more problems. So, to me, the transition can only happen if we can think about how transport itself can be introduced to become part of the urban life. And that is urban form. I don't know how we think about it. If we are going to go to power this Garden City or something like that.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think perhaps the first part of your question is really about why thinking relationally is so important. We can't afford for place just to be about that case study area, but it has to be about its interactions and how it's serviced. So we have to address these land use changes that happen over longer distances. It's not necessarily that that place is the place that's going to be the reason why that's solved, but those are issues which are tied together over multiple places, and then we know that's one that we should tackle, but that needs to be done at a different scale. And if we don't do that, then the response of that place will still have to be to go and service itself from multiple other locations. So I think that's really important, but I feel like we have to address how the existing urban form is going to be reimagined, because so much of it is already been there for 100 years in the UK and will continue to be that way. And we're still building stuff in stupid locations sometimes and making it more difficult. But that's the stock that we have to reimagine. Yes, we should do new developments better and differently, and maybe this kind of thinking can help with that. But we also, I think, have to ask ourselves, how will this get rewritten for those existing places? I find that that image I showed of the overparked street, what does that look like? At the moment, what that looks like is go and charge your car at the supermarket and pay 4 times as much as someone who can charge at their own house. We could find a solution for it, but it probably won't be one that works in a way that delivers the kind of equitable outcomes that we ought to be aspiring to. And that's why I think we have to pay attention to how the existing circumstances kind of will make pathways unfold in particular ways and what that would inscribe, unless we think about doing them differently.
My question. It was, so there are two things. It was a follow-up question to the first one earlier. And then another one, I guess related to the second question. It's okay. The first one is really, I'm not sure if what you think about the trailblazer definition deals, if this could be an opportunity for that national and local planning to, well, the local planning specifically, although this is just West Midlands combined authority and Greater Manchester combined authority, but I know West Yorkshire is going to happen. So what potential opportunity there is to build more place-based approach to transport, because local authorities such as West Midlands and GMCA will have more power and resources. So to that extent, I'm not sure if what we see as the opportunity in that. The second question is related to the second one. In your work, have you seen, and drawing on the relational view, have you seen anything on how infrastructure planning communicates with like transport planning? You've mentioned silos earlier, and these are the conversations we've had specifically, say for example, because I work in local authorities in the UK, with Welsh local authorities, with local authorities that are based in more rural areas. When we talk about decarbonizing transport for these areas where everything is far from each other, their approach is to do EVs rather than, say, for example, invest in public and active travel, also because you've mentioned that the resources are not enough. And so one of the things that I really is talk about the planning, can you build in places in the peaks and not everything is far from each other. And so you can encourage more public and active travel. Those are two separate questions, but
okay. So the first question is around a particular set of funding which the national government has given to our relatively recently devolved mayors to enable them to do more things locally, and whether that will unlock some of this thinking. I think it offers the potential to do that. Greater Manchester is interesting in that it has developed a joint spatial and transport plan. So it is thinking about things like economic inequities. It's also written its transport plan with kind of neighbourhood and local centres, the main regional centre, and is starting to think differently about how its plan will talk to communities with different types of needs. So in some senses, like they're heading in that direction, but I would say under-resourced or under-thought as to how the communities are going to influence that planning process. It's still quite new and it's still quite top-down, so I think it will miss some of that. I think the infrastructure planning one is really interesting. I mean, if I was going to be thinking about rapidly accelerating the decarbonisation of the number of miles that are driven in the UK, I think I would focus more of my attention on the rural market and how we would stimulate that and the fact that it's not going to be market driven, and there are some parts of our rural electric infrastructure that aren't up to task, and we've got hundreds of thousands of homes which are off gas grid, and therefore we would start to deliver or target our interventions on those areas which have very few alternatives, where perhaps we know that is the most likely pathway, and start engaging with those communities about, well, what can we do to enable that to happen. here, most of our charge infrastructure, as I said before, is getting hoovered into the middle of our big cities because we've got ultra low emission zones or whatever. They're where the shortest journeys happen. So we're not making the best use of the batteries that we're all that are being purchased. So this thinking about the relationship between the place and the other infrastructures, when no one's proposing a plan that tackles the almost complete absence of rural transport, and if no one's doing that, then what's the alternative? What is the net zero transition for those areas? And it might be that it needs to be more shared, more community oriented rather than more top down and market led, but would be great if we opened up those discussions.
I think Michael.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for this very, very interesting. I also really look forward to reading this informative decarbonization paper that you mentioned. I want to ask about something that I think is close to this place of variation in places theme that we talked about, and as well as land values and real estate values and connection to transport policy changes. And I find that they all thinking about the very brief example because I wonder if you have anything to say about economic and macroeconomic effects of transport changes. When I think about the specific something like in the Swedish context, and I think about here is the segment 5 and segment 6 people who have problems like swanky real estate in the suburbs, maybe some villas with a lot of equity for them. And when we think of the Swedish context, for instance, there's of course a lot of discussion about how to make suburbs drive less and so on, lots of these projects and to plan. I think for instance, my brother's place, which is built on last Swedish mid-level suburbs, quite nice for transportation, of course, having a car is and sort of being able to put park conveniently and so on. It's a very, very key part of why those homes are valued so much. You would imagine, I can sit here with this example, right? Like they promise everything the same when we change the transport policies. Let's say it becomes 20% more, less convenient to have a car or drive, etc. And it could be petrol prices, it could be parking and so on. What would be the impact then for the real estate price? 100,000 euros less, maybe not so much, but something like 50,000 euros maybe. And then of course we have sort of macroeconomic prices, right? Home values. So it's something you talk about in these groups. So like how, or is it something that comes up?
It's a really good question. I mean, I work with economists that look at the land value relationship with transport investments and transport policy. There's no one of that kind of mindset working in this centre. I guess, and it's interesting because in the UK, people get divided into able to pay and therefore kind of not really within the government kind of program because, well, when they want the heat pump, they've got the resources to do so, and then others, and then we think about programs that are for the others, and it kind of never touches back on land value. The main discussion that ever comes back to that is we don't have enough homes, we need more homes. That's pretty much as sophisticated, I think, as a lot of our land value discussions get. So I mean, that's interesting. I think it's possibly a critique to throw at thinking from a place perspective. There's loads of high carbon consuming places, and maybe the response from those places would be no thanks, or we're not in need of that pathway, or so. But that's part of, I think, being more political with this. So maybe, I mean, I don't have an answer to that. Something we need to think a bit more about. But yeah, I mean, it's a feature of places like home ownership is definitely part of our kind of package, because I think the divide between home owning and renting and the systems that drive behaviours in those two systems are quite different. But I haven't kind of gone back to what's the net implication on capital value.
Yeah. Obviously difficult to estimate exactly how much it is, but I think like the question on itself is maybe the same without exactly what would be specific.
Too many things provoking to discuss it here now. I would really like to continue this discussion here. But I mean, one point that I'm like, particularly on this slide, that I'm missing, and I would like to know if you have thought about it, is the service perspective on mobility. That's still transport plans called, which is like one example here would be, who's not here, are the pupils, or the pupils who have to be brought to school, which in Austria at least is financing basically all rural public transport. Because that's the request from the state to the state to say you have to provide the basic service of mobility in order that kids can have the basic service on education. And so this is a really huge factor that you haven't addressed here, for example. That would be the one thing. The other thing that makes it much more complicated is the energy part of it. If you have electric vehicles, that we just see in practice that the distribution system operators or utilities, they are not able to provide the infrastructure that is needed, neither for EV, neither for heat pumps, and they just refuse the request to say, okay, in 5 years you can build your stuff. So that would be another dimension for me on this local or spatial dimension. Have you discussed this also, this dialogue with the infrastructure providers?
Yeah, so we take the second one first because it's easier. Insofar as we've begun those discussions with the distribution network operators who are responsible for making the connections. There's for significant upgrades, there's a 2-year waiting list already for those areas where you can accommodate it, and there are other areas where you can't. And at the moment, I would say we're still in the foothills of the transition. We haven't got to the point where more of these capacity issues are going to be faced. So we are talking about how that's going to scale up. We're talking about how that's going to be paid for through electricity bills. And again, I think this is part of a non-place-based discussion, in terms of who's paying for it and how that's distributed. And, we know that because of our previous industrial structures, our infrastructure networks are stronger in some places than others, and therefore the costs and the connection times are different. And we're also looking at skills and the extent to which that's going to impact on prices in different areas. So we have begun those discussions, but it's kind of, I think every side's got a lot to learn from how the other side is working and thinking about it. The service provision one is interesting. I suppose it's we spent a long time thinking about that in previous centres, and then kind of saying, well, we need to go to a more place-oriented approach. We would expect that provision to come back out of that, and therefore for us to see which services are important in that context. But it's really important then that we draw that line back out to, well, why is that service provision there or not there? Why is it provided in the way it is? How is it funded? It's that relationality that we have to step back out from the place and make those connections up across scales. So that's, I think, how we'll come across them.
Yeah, I can't see it. I think I see that there's comments.
There's 10 Q&A. Oh no, it's all to do with can't hear me.
Exactly. So,
oh no, there's one from Arian, which is a question. So shall I read that? Yeah.
My question was about the role of place in electromobility transition, which is beyond local, extending to global. In our project about sustainable batteries, we found many hotspot environmental and social impacts, resource extraction of battery critical minerals, for example, in Africa. Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question. I guess in theory, we would trace that out from place right the way back to resource consumption. That's too much for this particular project, but we have got some other work which we're starting, which is looking at how we might move to mobility access models where people need to own far fewer vehicles, where the full life cycle analysis and the full social implications of all the batteries would begin to be incorporated. But again, I think place allows you to think about alternative mobility solutions that might function in different places. So at the moment, our models are that you buy one vehicle, or maybe more than one vehicle for your household. It's got, for the most part, 5 seats, weighs 2 tons, has a range of 300 miles, because that's what the providers are providing. As I showed before, 97% of our journeys are less than 35 miles in length, and simply don't need a range of 280 miles to fulfill most of our daily needs. So you could imagine, and there's an interesting piece of work by the International Transport Forum looking at light electric mobility options. I think it was more than a third reduction in battery production that would be needed, and you could still service everyone's mobility needs. So yeah, again, I guess it's that technology. If you take the technology provision adoption model, then it's a case of what is provided and how that's distributed. If we start from place, can we begin to demand different services and different ways of configuring those services? And how much of that is actually in the current commercial way of thinking, and how much of it might be more community interest? I mean, there's a lot of interesting things going on in community energy and, you know, local generation and so on that could extend to transport maybe. So yeah, I think there's lots of things to be answered about this. I'm just writing a contribution to a book with Monica Boucher, and one of the chapters is called Now Here, and it's all about the fact that we just imagine our now here, and we can ignore all of the digging that's going on elsewhere. But if we had a mine like that next to us, we wouldn't be happy about it. But yeah, so good question.
Are there any other questions? I think you have.
One thing that I found interesting, or that I still struggle with here, is the term pathways. How you use the term pathway, or how it is used. If I understood you correctly, you described basically as the line of each sector how you come to zero. So it's time is, so to say, the only dimension that we have there from the emission. And that's how modelers see what a pathway is. How would you on this local level describe a pathway narrative? What would be the important elements in such a narrative that you could really say it is really a pathway that you describe?
That's a really, really good question. I'm not sure I've got a coherent answer for you now, but I feel there's something in there about the national and the local, the kind of the intersection between changes which are going on broadly across the economy and its relation to what's specific and distinct about your place, and I guess which parts of that you will be enrolled in, which parts you don't want to be enrolled in, which alternatives. So I think, but I think we have to have that national, those big national changes have to be visible. Like there are these things that do need planning at a national scale, and people have to be aware of what the limits of what they can imagine change to not need to be, because, oh, don't worry, it's being dealt with somewhere else or not. So I think we have to put them kind of more in discussion with each other. I think it feels like quite a weak answer to your question.
Like to formulate, do you have a similar problem that I feel when I talk to people that tend to know what a transformation pathway is, how it's designed by IPCC, and meaning actually this line. I mean, this is not a pathway. It's not not even in a metaphorical way. It is.
It's what needs to be true, right? Yeah.
So, I mean, what do you work with models?
Definitely. As part of the previous project, part of that was kind of defining, I guess. We looked at the connectivity between different periods of time and the coherence of the narrative between, we started 10 years back and kind of looked at scales of change, for example, in journey patterns, and what might continue. Looked at things like 4-day working week and all sorts of different kind of social. So I think you can make these, like the changes, the social narrative, more real to people. We make very little effort to do that in the UK because we tend to talk more in terms of like net zero 2050, which enables people to separate out a bit between now and then a bit too much. But maybe there's something in what we did in the positive low energy futures. We didn't do it with communities. They are doing it now as part of a kind of co-design citizen assembly, where they're trying to get the citizens to think through what actually a reasonable pathway would be, because we were just trying to max out what we thought could be done, but that's not necessarily got any form of social mandate. So part of the idea of that work is to do that. So that might be an interesting piece to connect you to.
Yeah, just a question, because I find the sort of working with imaginaries quite useful in these sort of stagnant discussion, where you see sort of this sort of very rigid directionality when it comes to specific choices or technological choices. And I mean, I see some similarities when we look at the water sector, for instance. When you look at infrastructure to do with water, it tends to solidify around a specific imaginary. And while we're in agreement that we need other imaginaries, the question is, how do we actually bring these to the surface? And something that we've been thinking around is whether we need to think outside modernity, or in some ways, if we need to think about ways to draw the modernity to encompass other kinds of imaginaries, and sort of we approach this by thinking in terms of a new kind of imaginary, which we term as a modest imaginary, which doesn't necessarily stand against modernity, but it tries to sort of search for a new kind of sketch of something that is not yet found, because it's not easy to think of technology and say, this is the alternative imaginary, right? Because it doesn't. So it's something that I struggle with in my research. How do we actually identify or work with imaginaries, given sort of some of these complexities you've outlined here?
Yeah, again, really interesting question. When I took the paper on socio-technical imaginaries to our place reading group, I got absolutely taken to task on it because of people didn't really connect well with the thinking. And I guess my point was to bring it to the group because it doesn't work very well with place. I think they thought I was advocating that this was a route, but I think this idea of I guess you're talking about, well, what's the social future that we're imagining alongside the technical future, which is missing in the kind of, you know, the electric vehicle example I gave, which is really about replacing today's way of living with you know, different technology of some form, and then it's become something else with smart grids and P2X and so on. So I think those discussions have to start with what kind of place we're imagining. What will those activities look like? I think that was one of the benefits of the way we went about the positive low energy demand futures work. I think at least some of the other experimental work that we're about to start on is, well, let's start with how we're doing things. You know, what sorts of things will we be doing? What are we imagining about the? Do we want a society that's really distant from each other? Is it a more virtualized society? And then what fulfills those social futures? It can then be thought to be quite different, but it is really difficult. Like, you're asking an awful lot of big questions of community groups to engage with that, and we've got all this other stuff going on in our mind, but what about what that will mean for electricity grids or whatever? I don't know. I kind of feel like we as researchers will provide some important insights from that, but it's almost not scalable. Like, how will local authorities, with the amount of capacity they have, go out and recreate that? So in some senses, we have to be a bit more, if we can be a little bit more disruptive with the things that we do that are kind of perhaps showing alternative ways of doing things. We have in the previous centre looked at flights as part of this. So like the urban centres have lowest per mile emissions, but the highest per head flights. It's not quite the same as the consumption question, but actually when we tried to do the downscaling exercise, a lot of it does fall back to income when you're looking at industrial emissions, emissions from agriculture. You know, income, diet, spending on goods and services does look, and that's actually quite, my colleague who's kind of building a model so you can look at the carbon footprint across the country in various different ways. He says whenever he talks back to politicians about actually they say, well, what is it that's driving the difference between this community and that community there? And he said, well, mostly it's income. They immediately find that's very interesting. But they don't want to have that discussion. But I think we either kind of need to spend more time thinking about those distributional questions, and probably also addressing, well, how do we service that consumption in the economy? So yeah, there are people looking at some of those parts of things.
Thank you.
Thank you for your perseverance with the technology.
Yeah. And many thanks to you, Greg.